get back to work. No, I'm only joking. The jobs are all gone. We automated them all away. So today we are going to be talking about something like, what is the duty of the human condition? Why do we exist and what are we here for? In the past, on my other shows, I've used the phrase the stewards of nature, that the human condition is here to bring a kind of a sequence of events to the raw energy that is a natural power. This is not entirely divorced from the jobless problem, which at the moment I see as a conflict of goal alignment, where a lot of people are self-selecting themselves out of the economy because the goals of their bosses, the guys with a problem, don't align with theirs. And as a result, people feel disenfranchised. This is a tweet from one of my favorite Twitterers, Sigourney Beaver. And she is from Australia, and she has been tweeting against Abbott and his government about this sort of phenomena where being out of work becomes a full-time job because you constantly have to report to the government that you are looking for a job. And so what tends to happen is it rewards the administrivia, the people that are good at filing the paperwork and the people that are good at gaming that kind of system. And I've mentioned it before, and I mentioned it in this series of tweets with Talia Nazar, the journalist, the other day, where you do have a lot of homeless people and a lot of poverty sat right next to a lot of wealth and kind of juxtaposed, because of course, you know, the poor need money because they need to survive, whereas the rich, they need to be there because of their pride and their ego. And I think I kind of mentioned in that thread a little bit about this common statistic that you may have seen if you're into like Malthusian philosophy and this overpopulation myth, that it is technically possible to fit every single human being into a townhouse in the state of Texas, minus the infrastructure. So I'll post this down in the links below. This is a critical look at that claim, this article here, at how we can all coexist. And the point that it's trying to make in summary is that your body is much bigger than where your skin ends, because actually in order to sustain your existence, you also need a whole bunch of farmland. You need a whole bunch of factories all over the world. So your very presence and your very existence on this planet is kind of necessitated by an industrial complex, a kind of viscose. And really today we're going to be talking about land use and who really, you know, how we should conduct ourselves related to the earth right beneath us. So in a kind of pacifist fashion, I've kind of been invaded by some of my guests from yesterday. David sent me this great email and he introduced me to James and Chris. I'm not going to introduce you one by one because I think it might take too long. But we also have Ksenia from yesterday, who is coming from Sweden, who is originally from Moscow, and we have Pi Rebel, aka Nick, and Theo as well. So David, why don't I hand over to you and you can start talking a little bit about how human beings should start acting better or something.
Okay.
You're muted. You just muted yourself.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I'd rather probably start a little bit a smaller scale and end up with maybe more general moral lessons for humanity, which I don't hardly feel qualified to preach on. But I think that today, basically, I invited last minute a couple of people together that are beginning to look at, or have been working, in fact, for some of them for 10, 15 years, in terms of alternative ways that groups of people can live together and cooperate financially and work-wise. So the three themes of, if you like, environment, land use, and technical legal mechanisms for cooperation, whether they be community currencies or legal structures that allow people to cooperate, all interweave here. So certainly, although initially you kind of faze me a little bit when you make these big connections between the environment and between land and cryptocurrencies, I agree with you. They are deeply connected in terms of the big picture. But bringing it back to very practical, immediate things that we can all do together, it's also very concrete. So James over in Berlin, I met recently. Well, I can't remember the first time we met, but I met recently in Matera, a southern Italian town in a project started by Edge Riders and Ben Vickers called the Unmonastery, in which an empty piece of land was donated by the city for a group of artists, hackers, environmentalists to look at how they could spend the time taking the metaphor of, if you like, monasteries and monks in terms of their history and their engagement with local communities. So the land was provided for free. People stayed there eating local produce. You know, living costs were about €200 a month per person for 3 months. I stayed there 3 months. Ksenia was there as well. And James, I met James there. James is now, he's been traveling around since we shared. That's, I think, about 4 months with a group of hackers and socially motivated people looking at building and making things by working together, and they're looking to see how they can sustain themselves in terms of a digital nomad type lifestyle. And I've been talking to James about what we're trying to do, myself and Ksenia, that is, in terms of sharing in a couch surfing type way. Like, I have a flat. It's actually a council flat. It's a government flat in London, which provides very low rent for myself. And I'm not legally allowed to, well, I am actually legally allowed to sublet it. But what I would like to do is to provide the spare room that I have in my council flat as a non-commercial exchange for people to stay to work on social projects. So that I can maybe exchange where I live and work to another city, and people come and stay in my flat. And that idea, for instance, in terms of social housing alone, that we could kind of in some way pool our own private abodes so that we can engage in productive exchanges for our mutual benefit, or even the benefit of society, is something which is very practically open to us. It's basically some sort of couch surfing type ideal. Chris Cook has been working on community land trusts and legal structures and democratic and currency platforms. I've known Chris for probably 20 years now, and he's got a lot to say about energy-backed exchange mechanisms and structures for funding these sorts of communally owned places. And it introduced me, in fact, today when I chatted to him. I haven't spoken to Chris probably in about 6 months, and I said, "Oh, come along to this hangout," to the term land as a service, you know, like platform as a service and so forth. The idea that we can reconceive a lot of things that are currently being reconceived sort of financially and economically as something which we prepay as a service rather than a piece of property that we own. And as part of that reconceiving of all these basic concepts that we have, like property and money and votes, we, I think, must build into the feedback loops that are vital if we're going to look at sustainability and environmental sustainability in particular. So what we need to do is start to build in the externalities that are ignored by present bad game design, basically, which is what we're in the midst of.
So it's like you're changing the incentive structures, and it sounds to me like that sounded like a really good idea. You're talking about like an open source egalitarian Airbnb there.
Yeah, and you know, that it hinges on topics like we began to talk about yesterday in terms of Ethereum and smart property, the legal arrangements that you can make in terms of distributed organizations, the sorts of currencies that people can do in terms of putting in time to develop the properties or to do work within those properties. And yeah, that's what I would really like to talk about because of the people that were introduced, how land can be viewed as a cornerstone for, if you like, a sustainable form of living. So one guy who's not here today, which I was hoping to introduce everyone to, who I only met again 2 days ago, is a guy called Thomas Höpfner, who is currently, for instance, looking to purchase some, I think the land is going to be donated by some North English state, Lancaster or somewhere like that, and he wants to get a group of people in urban environments, kind of digital nomads of the style that actually James is actually living right now, who like both, I mean, these strange new creatures, like both they're drawn to the get rid of technology in your mobile phones and go and live in some eco-village somewhere, and at the same time have gadgets coming out their ears and have a strong need to also network and go to cities. So some lifestyle where you have half the people in some sort of co-working space in the cities, but when they want to go away and work in a meditative sort of space for 6 weeks, have the right, because they are co-owners in a sense of a community land trust, to the rural spaces as well. And so we've been talking quite a lot, both with James and with other people, about how this complementary nature of kind of nomadism, but having home bases which we in some sense co-own through such mechanisms of community land trusts, could work and could function, and how we can start it actually. And certainly we're starting it over the next 4 months. We're going to be offering residencies at my flat in London. James, who's just vanished.
Yeah, but Chris and James have just gone. But I want to ask you, you said something interesting there that I've noticed before about a lot of these kind of back to nature kind of people that I've met, and I spent some time at Occupy hanging out with these people as well, is that they do want to get away from the city state and the urban environment and go back to nature. But when they do, they always take their smartphones with them. Have you noticed that?
Yeah.
They're still connected. They're still available.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean
the city state. So you're not really divorced. You've still got that umbilical cord, no?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's yeah. I mean, that's a strange one. I mean, I think it's vital that I think one of our only tools that we have to resist what the really powerful dominant forces on the planet are our ability to network and communicate. So while there's an aesthetic and genuinely magnificent sort of narrative behind the desire to cut yourself off from these polluting, evil gadgets that take up brain space to stop us talking to each other face to face, I think they're fundamentally the swords of our our future rebellion, and we need to hang on to them, whether we hate them or not.
So Nick, what will you make of all this?
Oh, I have to agree with David on this. I think he's right that they are the swords of change, and even though like you're going out and getting away from the city-state, being connected to the internet isn't the same as being connected to your city or your nation or your state at all. You know, like we use the internet as almost like a second brain where we go to dip for things. You know, we keep references here and then we pull up the rest of the information on our phones. I think that's an important thing that isn't ever going to go away now that it's become a thing.
And I do see, though, that there are these two strong tribes. I mean, I noted from the recent 3 months when we were in Matera, there was a radical division between two groups. One group of people who really loathed mobile phones, and another group of people who were substantially into technology. They were all after the same thing, but in terms of culture and fashion, there was a big divide between those two groups. I tend to get quite passionate about this particular debate because I've been involved in issues like the digital divide and working with communities and open source for a very long time, and it is utterly clear to me that there has never been a more democratic digital communicative technology for the liberation socially of mankind than the mobile phone, the smartphone specifically. So
how do we, what would be a starting point? Because at the moment, one of the first things you notice when you start a job for the first time is the way that the company communicates with its stuff. Right. The first thing you've got to learn is all the little idiosyncrasies. You've got to use their database, and it's this proprietary platform that they paid because the friend of the director owned this company that made CRM software, and so they had to put in the buy order. And so you end up bending yourself. You end up being given some shitty old BlackBerry because BlackBerry are going down, so they've got to offload those, and your company bought those up. You've got to have 3 phones. You've got all these identities that you've got to manage in your life as well, because you've probably got a family and this and that. How do we, like a bunch of individuals, Occupy never stopped, did it? This is Occupy right now. We just moved. We just didn't hang out at St. Paul's anymore or Wall Street. We now went back to our bedrooms, and then when the bandwidth got good enough and Google launched this software, you know, people like you, me, and Theo, Nick, you know, Ksenia, we could get together and we can start collaborating. But I've yet to see like a bunch of, I don't know if I can call us anarchists, but activists, let's say we're a bunch of activists, actually get on with each other. Because usually what I see with these projects is they have some impact for a little while, and you know, people go out with their ready-made banners and they protest, but nothing really changes in the long term, does it? And isn't that because of the way we communicate and our tools?
No, it's not because of the way we communicate. It's not because of our tools. Absolutely not. It's because of how you structure power. So basically, human beings left to their own devices are a bit like Lord of the Flies, right? They will, specifically if you put them in a space where they can just yabber on about politics or issues, they will fight like cats, and they will do it verbally. The conversation will go around in circles, and they will do it physically. You know, it's only what if you want something to grow and evolve and progress, you've got to do the same sort of thing that any organism does. You need like membranes, semi-permeable membranes. You need DNA that is passed on over a long period of time. Now, our social DNA used to be, you know, we used to be structured as tribes, you know, with physical violence and kings, strong leaders, and military leaders, and that was, but far more powerful, and recently we're structured in terms of companies. Nation states kind of were large tribes, largely speaking, but the DNA of our company structures is law. So the only way, I mean, and I've seen the same as you, I've seen groups form, and they can form for and die and be absorbed by the system. Classically speaking, they're absorbed after 3 years or something like that. It's about the same as a relationship often breaks apart. You know, groups can be driven by an inspiring leader, an ethos, an idea, a movement. But in the end, if they end up adopting the same old legal structures, you know, whether it be a charity, whether it be a for-profit company, there are about 4 of them you can pick and choose from. You end up being sucked as people get replaced and what have you into pretty well the same old behavior, because effectively the DNA of power is the same. And the personalities become replaceable. You know, you can get quite a long way with personalities and soft culture, but basically, unless we do something about, so Occupy ideals taken to a hangout and discussing things is not going to. We're still going to have circular conversations. On the other hand, if we have a target where, let's say, how many of us, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of us, have to make something, and we have to agree on a budget, and we form a legal structure, as long as it's a binding promise, a commitment, ideally in law, which constrains us in ways of operating that are based on value systems that are inherently where that DNA, if you like, is reflecting and amplifying richer values than conventional business or organizational structures.
That sounds really. I want to. Let's talk to Chris before his computer crashes again. So introduce yourself, Chris. What do you make of what David's saying.
Well, I only caught half, well, the end bit really, but I do know that David shares a lot of my thinking on the importance of, let's call it legal code. Lessig and his law is code. And, for those guys who don't know my background, I've spent maybe 30 years in this law is code space. And I've done a lot of law, but I'm not a lawyer. And I've done a lot of accounts, but I'm not an accountant. I've been a director of a global energy exchange. I designed the UK natural gas futures contract, and I go around apologising for that these days. I set up a .com, which had the purpose of generic transaction registration valid across the globe, and everybody wanted to own it. But if anybody owned it, nobody else would use it. And I realised that I come up against a business model problem, which I call the liquidity neutrality paradox. If it's liquid, it's not neutral, and if it's neutral, it's not liquid. And I realized at that point, after 3 years banging my head against a brick wall, that what was lacking were the correct protocols, because everything that we do is a protocol. We don't realize it, but a government's a protocol. A job is a protocol. Freehold and leasehold land is a protocol. Companies have protocols. Everything we do is all about protocols, and of course that is this whole space we're in at the minute. And Ethereum, we're looking at protocols. That's what I was doing 15 years ago when I came up with a market user agreement, as I then called it. And I've been interested for some considerable time in the fact that, in my view, the protocols that we take for granted are fundamentally and absolutely broken in a way which dates back maybe 2,000 years, and that this is, if you like, the basis of the Anglo system, based on Roman law and absolute. It's Newtonian. It's absolute. It's either absolute ownership or dated temporary debt, or freehold and leasehold. And in fact, that's not the way the world is. In Scotland we have guilty, not guilty, and not proven. There's a third space. There's this space of uncertainty. And in my view, there are protocols. This is what I've been working on for the last 10, 15 years, of associative, interactive protocols, agreements whereby people can come together to do what they want to do, because money never made anything. Okay, money is just an agreement. Property, actually, is not a thing, and money is not a thing. Property is a relationship. It's the agreement between the subject, the exerciser of the rights, and the object, that which the rights are exercised over, the property rights. And money actually is a relationship. It's not a thing, although we're used to it being that. And the reason I came up with the concept, or the thought, that land could be a service and that energy could be a service, is that at the moment we've gone over a period of thousands of years from an economy which I call it economy 1.0, which was decentralized but disconnected, when
another computer crash. Oh, that was so interesting as well.
Yeah, that was great.
No, Theo, come on.
Okay, yeah, I think everything sounds really interesting, and sounds like he had a lot of good ideas with protocols, and he did some big stuff. I mean, I've been in, I think I was trying to think. I think it was over 10 years ago. We lived all together at a kind of like how travelers live, like on a piece of land, and we all had our own little trailer and stuff. And that was kind of like basically everybody had to go. The main rule we had is that everybody had to go to the weekly meeting, and you had to sit through this really long meeting every week. And yeah, sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. You know what I mean? But basically there was a kind of consensus. I don't know what. We didn't think of it as a technical consensus. Sometimes it was agree to disagree and so on. But we had a kind of protocol, but it also had a lot of problems. And I think that's why, hold on, what's your name? Like David said, these things last like 3 years or so, and then they kind of fade away for different reasons. And that kind of, a lot of the things I was involved in kind of took that course too. Or also tribal things. I'm into martial arts, and there's like kind of like a tribe feeling. So we have like a rules to the how we do things, that we don't destroy each other, but that we fight against each other in order to improve each other. And that's the fundamental rule. We have a funny rule: everybody goes home with the same IQ that they came with. Everybody be friends at the end of the day. So we want to push each other to the limit, but we don't want to destroy the same member of the tribe, because that doesn't make any sense. And that works. That works really well, actually, and it's really amazing that it does work, and people really do push each other. So that's work. But that's just just for that. I mean, we don't live together. We don't have to cook together. We don't have to, do things like that. It's just for those minutes where we're fighting each other that we follow that protocol. But that seems to work. But what I wanted to say is,
sorry, I monopolize things rather.
yeah. But what I wanted to say is that we should just think of something small that we can scale. Like I think, David, you mentioned it last time, or something like that. And we've mentioned it before, that we can, let's, instead of, we need to talk about it and talk about what protocol we want to agree on and so on, but let's do something relatively simple that we can get going, and let's just do it. And let's, form this kind of organization, figure out what we want to do, and let's do it and live by example and use a blockchain technology in order to do this protocol. And I think that we should just, I mean, we have to figure out something, useful but simple enough that we can scale, and something that doesn't take like, 6 months or a year to organize.
Can I describe what I imagine here, just to allow people to hack it? So I basically imagine that we can quite quickly collect 4, 5, or 6 apartments in interesting places around Europe, and that we can agree, get them to join a legal entity, an association, which allows and creates some software which allows scheduling of exchanges and non-commercial kind of residencies where work can be done without payment. So that would allow people in social housing or people in rented accommodation, Airbnb style, or even squats, to engage in exchanges which aren't just 2-3 days, but are literally maybe a month or 2 months type periods. That we can set up. We can set up the legal entity as a voluntary association, as a one-click org. I don't know how many people know that. And I've been talking to Ksenia about doing that. I think we actually have one called the Real Space Association, which are real spaces. We can also then partner with larger type spaces, social spaces, like the Unmonastery, like the one that's been proposed in North. There are about 3 or 4 of these kind of larger live-work spaces, which maybe can house them, that may be bought, and the group finances through a community land trust. So if we set up the legal structure that Chris is talking about and other people have, we would as a group be able to look to raise finance to co-own these spaces, and yet we can start quickly.
That's precisely what I was getting to, and I forget who intervened. I didn't catch your name. Theo. But Theo, thanks very much for the intervention, because that's precisely what I'm about doing. You've got to actually show people how this is done, and you've got to do it in a practical way at a local level. If you want resilient macro, you've got to start micro. No question about that.
That's a very good point. Can I just jump in, because I think this is related, because I wanted to talk about friendship and tribes. Ksenia, could you speak a little bit about, I think you had some thoughts regarding the nation state as a tribe, no?
Oh, no. Yeah, nation state is completely different from tribe, because it's like a kind of an imaginary construct. But I just wanted to say that I sort of really have, I'm really tempted to go into metabolics and sort of philosophy and stuff, but I really like where this kind of conversation is flowing into prototyping small examples, because otherwise it just goes on forever, and the word like philosophers basically writing about this stuff much better than we talk about it. So I'm completely happy with the conversation. I might comment later.
So yeah, so in a way you're sort of talking about having human action and human organization mirror organisms. The organization mirrors the natural organism. I mean, we do that with our inventions already. Planes imitate birds, for example. We already do borrow from nature a lot.
You're sort of maybe talking about like systems in a sense, because this morning we spoke with James about infrastructures and systems and kind of also you mentioned nature and kind of this dichotomy between nature and a human, and I'm kind of skeptical of this dichotomy because it's like some sort of infrastructure is as just another system in a way, and you can prototype it in some way when it works and show to other people. But yeah,
the thing is, we are nature, but we have to work very hard at being natural. I think it's very quick for our pride to take over. Say again?
There is no such a thing as nature.
There's no such thing as nature. So
Sorry.
say a bit more.
Sorry, I shut up now. I let other people talk because I'm getting a little bit into like meta stuff.
All right, well, I'm going to mentally tag that. So we haven't heard from James yet. James, are you there? I'm one of those talk show hosts, and it's like,
yeah.
There you go. Hello.
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry, my Wi-Fi's a bit low, so I dropped out a couple of times. So I've only had the past couple of months.
So what do you want to say?
That's right. I guess I kind of like this idea of just doing it. I've spent most of my life working in technology, and I'm quite anti-technology. I'm a little bit resistant to the idea of to solve some of these very hard problems. We need to apply lots of new software like blockchains, and to build this network of spaces, we need to write some scheduling software. I think there's a lot to just do it. I believe in bottom up, and just finding these spaces and making them available will be, I think, much more beneficial than kind of taking this top-down tools approach.
But shouldn't we have a meeting about it first, James? Maybe we should just meet about it and talk about it first. I'm kind of being sarcastic. I'm giving you something to respond to, like John Cleese in Life of Brian, where he's like the People's Judea Front or the People's Front of Judea, and then they just keep having meetings about this uprising, but they never actually do it.
Sure. This is exactly my point, and there are a lot of people having these meetings. So let's just do it. If you have a house with some spare space, if you know somebody with a house that's not being used, then part of what we're doing now is making available a very simple matching system. So you just list your space, you make it available to a group of people who can use it, and the people come and use your space.
And where can people find out more about this? What's the link? Is there a link?
Yeah, we have a Facebook group. Apologies for that, but I'll post the link to the Facebook group.
Yeah, put it in the group chat, and then I'll post it to the main comments there, because that sounds really interesting. And of course, you're apologizing for Facebook. Facebook is now one of the largest or second largest database of human beings in the world. And although I hate it, I do accept that a lot of activists do kind of need it, because that's where the attention is. Facebook have done such a good job of getting all the eyeballs onto their website.
And I should point out as well that James and the crew are working on some extremely interesting distributed and advanced scheduling and matching software. So while he might be absolutely right, and I agree that the big mistake is, and I think it was a mistake we talked about in terms of Ethereum yesterday, is in a way to start with a technical solution, and then maybe look for users and problems. What we can do here is just do what James is talking about, is start finding spaces, start the exchanges, and as soon as it becomes complex enough, and we know it will be, that we need to do some scheduling that, I don't know, Google Calendar doesn't solve for us, or that we need to invest money to make sure that we're not just engaging in gentrification of areas, which is a classic sort of issue for these sorts of projects, but we actually own the land and we can pass that value back in a sustainable way, then we need to be setting up these structures, and we need to be doing that not in advance of doing stuff on the real ground, but in sort of an agile growth process. So we need to do some work, test it out, build some tools, do some work, test it out, build some tools, in a way in which we have that nice dynamic where we're not tempted to spin off into just futile debate or futile code creation, but we are, on the other hand, not just building brick walls with our hands and not laying down the necessary patterns which other people can take up, clone, and replicate at other spaces.
Yeah, well, I'm totally in agreement that we shouldn't just use technology for its own sake, because technology, of course, comes with its own problems and its own burdens. That really the techne, the art, because that's what the word technology means. It just means craft or art. It should be a response to the challenges in the environment and not the first go-to thing that you do just because it's nice and shiny. Now, the thing that I think is coming up is that I want to talk about tally sticks, because that's coming up in our private group chat. This comes up a lot more than you think in cryptocurrency conversations. I've noticed it come up a number of times in industry podcasts, because essentially, and also if you look up on your favorite search engine, preferably not Google, the Isle of Yak, Let's Talk Bitcoin did a really good podcast and blog entry about these big stones that were used on this island, and the residents there used these stones to keep a record, a metaphorical record of all of the trade and the barter that was taking place. So we do need, if we're going to organize together into some kind of cohesive group, apparently based on history, some kind of ledger or some record of account, because otherwise you create asymmetries within the group. For example, with World Crypto Network, we want to turn that into a distributed autonomous organization. But I said, look, I'm a bit hesitant to run the Twitter account. I've run Twitter accounts before. I'm quite good at it. I do a lot of community management. But I don't want to sink more of my precious time that I'm not getting paid for into something that eventually will just end up, amounting to nothing, and then I can't really say I've done anything useful with those hours. So in a way, it would help if I could register, even if it doesn't get paid for, at least register in a log entry somewhere, so that someone at some point in time can say, look at all the work that's been done by this person. So do any of you see the necessity for why we might need something like a blockchain record of work that's been performed?
Just a quick counter example to that. There's a myth in economics that currencies were invented because of the barter inequality problem, where if I have an apple and you have a goat, and I want some goats and you want some apples, we can't do a trade because I only have one apple right now.
Yeah, the coincidence of wants is often called.
Yeah, and this myth is actually not true. If you have a community where people do not try and make these measurements. So there's an argument that says that a community will be more efficient if everybody just contributes what they can to their community. So I think we need to remember there's an argument for communities which are focused on giving or sharing rather than measuring value.
So that flies directly in the face of objectivism and this need for quantification. And I don't know where I come down on it just yet, but I do see that there is a limit to people's benevolence, that people often run out of, if things aren't taken account of, people will run out of goodwill eventually, won't they?
I made the joke last time about family resemblances rather than direct references. And in James's example is apparently, I haven't looked into the original research myself, but historically accurate, that it didn't come from, if you like, direct quantification of exchanges. But that is not to say it was a nice, happy, hippy-dippy giving thing. It was a vicious economy of respect, right? If your neighbor came round, you were honor bound to donate what you had, and you made damn sure that was repaid at some time, and you weren't abused, because otherwise you were having the piss taken out of you. And these sorts of really quite, I mean, they weren't soft. People would fall out. They would go to war if respect wasn't shown, right? So there was a tally stick, but it was a family resemblance. It wasn't a sort of a mathematical quantification. It was, you've gone too far here, mate. You've pushed the boundary beyond the pale. You know, these sorts of phrases, and those sorts of phrases and those sorts of concepts to me are precisely what a semi-permeable membrane is in terms of an organization. It's right. You don't want something too rigid, like you know, a mathematical equation. You want something which is not too poetic, that it can fall apart and it can't replicate and it can't pass down the generations. You want something which can evolve, change and mutate, learn and adapt, but retain its kind of basic architecture. And we know quite a lot about how to build those things now, and that's why, you know, we need, you know, if you take biological metaphors, you need skeletons, you need architecture, you need some hard mechanisms, specifically if you want to scale very, very fast and very far. But if you want rich, evolving structures, you need to refer to metaphors like language and DNA possibly, and semi-permeable and something a little bit softer.
So you're talking about creating an anti-fragile structure that can grow from its failings. A bit like a market, really. A market is supposed to be an anti-fragile structure that grows from its failures, isn't it?
Markets, I see them as an alien species that descended mathematically on biology quite recently. Okay, I think markets work excellently at a certain small scale. You know, marketplaces. You know, but when they go to a global scale, they're like birds of paradise. They're diseases that are destroying our planet.
What do you make of the Clue Train? Do you ever read the Clue Train manifesto? It started with that great line: "Markets are conversations." And at the moment, the market hypothesis relies on the assumption that we should necessarily, that A, we know what we want, and that B, that we necessarily should get our desires met. So if I have the desire for that, I should be able to go to the market, apparently, and I should be able to get that, reach a fair price.
I think that the problem...
That sounds silly to me. I mean, it just sounds silly because it's ignoring the basic recursive feedback loops. You know, markets create their own needs and desires and demand. They're not just, you know, human nature satisfied by market. There's the linear story.
Could I interject?
Chris, yeah, please.
Markets are something I do know something about, having been involved in one for a long, long time. To me, markets are a wonderful thing, but not the markets we've got. Okay, my point is that the existing market, which is owned and run in the interests of middlemen, is completely toxic, and that what we need to do is to go back to a network version of the original market, which actually was a direct person-to-person market. But we need to now go, well, okay, now it's presence on the network. You see, a seller has an interest in, for instance, in a stable high price. A buyer has an interest in a stable low price. A middleman, on the other hand, has no interest in stability, because for him stability is death. He also has no interest in transparency. For him, transparency is death. Okay? It is the presence of intermediaries in markets which completely fucks them up every time. And what we are now able to do, thanks to what I call the Napsterization of markets, this is the opportunity, is to make this direct connection between seller and buyer. And the instrument which the tally stick documented, this thing I call it's a credit instrument, i.e. it's just a voucher issued by a producer of value, an energy credit or a rental credit or a my time credit or an Airbnb one bed night credit, to come back to the problem we're talking about. That's what we can do. We can create a new currency of bed nights if we like, and we can actually start saying, okay, in exchange for that I'm going to do A, B and C, and you've got a direct exchange now which cuts out the middleman, which is managed by a service provider whose interests are aligned with those whose services he is providing. That's the market of the future to me, a cooperative of service users working with a cooperative of service providers to provide a neutral, generic platform. That's the way I see it. No rent seeking, no middlemen, no volatility any more than is inevitable. That's the market of the future.
Yeah, so what I think what you're, if I understand you right, you're talking about man-made volatility in the case of the middleman. You're not talking about natural volatility as part of nature. You're talking
Correct.
about, yeah.
You will always get, supply and demand for corn will change with a bad harvest and a poor harvest, but it will not be artificially constrained by market manipulation, as happens with every market I have ever seen. When a middleman comes in, hoards the corn, and lets it out nicely at the right time and to make a profit,
So here's something very powerful. Then we've got cryptography that's come along since Bletchley Park. It's moved on a lot since the Nazis' Enigma machine in terms of its development, and it's a product of war. This is an invention, including the mobile phone, also came from World War One. These inventions have come along, and they're no longer working for the superpowers. They're now working for everybody because everyone has access to them. And cryptography has come along such a long way, and the bandwidth has come along, so the latency is so reduced that I can pretty much create a currency for anything now, because I can create these blockchain databases, the principal difference being that everyone owns the database, not just a small group of individuals. And I can actually, I mean, we had somebody ask the question yesterday in the Ethereum. He said, can I notionally prove I produced some artwork by creating a hash of it and then putting the hash in the blockchain, which means that forever that art will be tied to him because he put that in the blockchain. He can then live on that. He can actually say, this is my currency, as it were. Right, this is what I do, and he can live off of his reputation. Is it something like that we're turning everything into currency?
I wouldn't call it current. No. Could I just say I see that as his capital, okay? Because that has a value in use over time, and capital has a value in use over time. I think there are a lot of problems with. You see, currency is not necessary for exchange. If I give you my IOU and you give it to David, and he gives it to somebody else who eventually gives it back to me in exchange for something which I provide to him, that is the way that business used to be done by merchant banks at the beginning. It was called real bills. And in fact, you know, the whole point about Ripple, you may have come across Ripple, is that you can actually settle transactions A to B to C to D to E and back to A again without the need for currency at all. And that is not understood. Currency, on the other hand, where something what I call like peer to asset, a rental credit or an energy credit, which everybody would accept in exchange because they have a need for somewhere to live or a need to keep themselves warm or whatever. Those are, currency is something that is generally acceptable in exchange. So I would say credit and the circulation of what I call people-based credit is going to be within some form of credit creation and clearing system. It requires it requires protocols of trust to do so.
So I just want to make sure I understand this right. So currency I just take to mean flow. It just means something can flow, right?
Okay.
And the beauty of these cryptographic hash functions, tell me if I'm speaking over and above your knowledge, but these cryptographic hash functions provide a nomenclature now. So that work of art no longer has to be recognized by a human being. Let's say you have to be an art expert to be able to recognize it. It can be hashed into the blockchain such that anyone can now give it a name. That name is then universally recognized anywhere in the world. We still don't quite have the physics yet because we can't do this on physical objects, but we can do it to digital objects at the moment. But obviously a lot of work is being done to make that a bit more broader. And as such, Tony, the guy asking the question, would then always be, no one could ever take his work away from him. Everything that he did in his life and all of his work would always permanently be part of him. Do you see what I mean?
You're talking about a title registry, or essentially.
I guess so.
There are two things necessary, I think, in every market. One is a title registry, and the other is a transaction registry. And that is the case. So title is sort of who owns what. And I think it was Robin Bloor said that electronic money, he said, knows who owns it. Okay, as opposed to cash, which is anonymous. And I think what we're talking about here, what you're mentioning, is money's worth rather than money. I think of it as capital because for me, capital has a value in use. Okay, and that value in use you can then buy and sell units of with credits. So he could maybe sell the right to view his painting for an hour or something like that, and that is distinct from his ownership of the painting, of course. So you do need the blockchain. For me, ties these things together. That's the way I see it. It enables a transaction and title repository to be interlinked. That's the beauty of it.
There's a couple of things that, I mean, I don't know. I get out of my depths in this area, and Chris is certainly a far bigger expert on the way that existing financial markets work. However, when I hear Chris talking like this, and I hear what can be done in terms of the blockchain and the sorts of written agreements that can be made that are provable, I think there is room for something that extends the very limited conceptions of registries and transactions that come from historical markets. Mm-hmm. So I think we can still learn a lot by really understanding a phenomenally successful tool that has several thousand years of history, if you like. Maybe a lot less recent in terms of modern markets, but I do think that there's two dangers or two important things that are missed when we get into kind of cryptocurrency markets, money currencies, asset classes, and all of this sort of stuff. The biggest one is it's all very good for kind of what I'd call efficiency of moving and doing stuff, of producing stuff and what have you. But there's some problems with efficiency, if you like. You know, and when I look at, we were talking about land originally and what have you, cities have become incredibly efficient at exploiting empty space to the detriment of people living there. There aren't the scrap yards and the weird squats and the things and the bizarre corner shop that used to be there. The more efficient these mechanisms that Chris is talking about, whether we get rid of middlemen or not, right, we're talking about improving efficiency. And the more efficient they get, the likelihood is the more certain of the inherent problems of markets will become more powerful. And it's not just middlemen are the problem. There's a problem, I believe, inherently in a very important form of destruction of diversity. You might get a lot of diverse products being created, but they're all kind of inherently linked to a base supply chain and very large multinational companies that produce them. And that means that it's very easy to knock the whole thing out. It's not got the resilience that you get with diversity. And from a human point of view, inefficiencies can be beautiful from an aesthetic point of view, right? We don't want to really live in a super efficient, you know, everything perfected kind of way. We want places to play. We want our kids to get lost on the railway tracks. You know, we want this sort of stuff. And there are reasons, good biological, good moral, good learning reasons why we want that kind of inefficiency, redundancy, play space stuff. And improving the efficiency of markets isn't the answer to all of that stuff. On the other hand, the creation of some richer tools using languages that you might call law, and me and Chris differ. I talk quite a lot about decision making and voting and how people get together, and Chris is very much on you don't need that. You can kind of have individuals with the right protocol interacting when they need to. I think I'm right in paraphrasing that, Chris, but I would say that there is more to stories like Ethereum and the sorts of social organizations we can make than market efficiencies and morally correctly operating markets.
Well, you know, can I just interject before somebody else comes in and say it all depends what metric you use to describe efficiency. You know, you have least sterling cost is the efficiency that's killing this planet, and least dollar cost. You've got what the Danes do, which is least carbon fuel cost, which I commend to people. But what we have been lacking is least human cost, you know? And you know, I agree with you, David. We have to look again at what we mean by efficiency here. And I have to say that I do actually believe more in the need for social I see the future as a sort of interaction of social and market that doesn't exist yet. The two things should be two sides of the same coin, but they're not. Anyway, over to somebody else.
I want to hear this is brilliant, by the way. I'm really enjoying this guy. I want to hear James talk about the industrial desire for efficiency as in contrast to the human desire.
Yeah, I mean, it just makes me anxious when people talk about trying to make things more efficient. These things kind of seem like the drivers behind what causes people to leave their nice life living in the countryside and go to the city. It's because the city is where all these industries are that are focusing on these non-human drives for efficiency. And what is the thing that makes these organizations strive for efficiency? It's because they measure their profit, and so they're just trying to increase profit margins.
So so the word profit, I mean, I take it that's a progress. So what kind of progress are we looking for, if not a financial one?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about social progress, then we have to try and make social progress regardless of and as disconnected from the financial cost as we can.
I think profit and loss are just so last century. They're creatures of double entry. They come out of double entry bookkeeping, which is so last century. And what we should be looking at is shared surplus value, to coin an expression. But what does value mean anyway? Value is not money. Money is just a claim over value. And there are different types of value, including the spiritual and the emotional, which you can't even quantify by a metric,
And if you could, they wouldn't be worth anything.
Exactly.
You can with a family resemblance.
Oh, he's Wittgensteinian. And any Ayn Rand's fans watching this are going to be pulling their hair out every time you mention Wittgenstein, which I love the idea of, by the way. And I wanted to pass this over to Theo and Ksenia because we haven't heard much from them. But before I do, I wanted to introduce everyone to this book, Pip Pip, by Jay Griffiths. And it's a wonderful book all about time, and you know how big a fan I am of time. And in the last part of the book, she basically says that economists like Robert Solow argue that the present should deprive the future of non-renewable natural resources, assuming, as he does, that nature can be replaced by financial capital. And she talks in this narrative that we are basically stealing from the future to pay for today. So when you do sip on your Frappuccino latte and you watch the bombs fly in Gaza and you're tweeting about it in kind of frustration because there's really nothing you can do about it, think about the fact that that is the sweet taste of future people dying as you enjoy yourself, because that's largely how we're kind of paying for it. And with that bombshell, I'd like to ask Theo what he thinks. What do you make of all this, Theo?
What do I make of Frappuccinos and bombs? Well, like I said earlier, it's all about now we can consume those things and we don't have very much direct relationship with it because everything is really disconnected. So we can, we have our iPhone or whatever you have, and like you said, it's made in Asia and it looks cool, and I can be high tech and I'm into green stuff, but in reality, you had to use the copper mines to get all that stuff. And if I really knew what the human cost of it, then I probably wouldn't carry it around if I really saw what that human cost really was. But I don't know. I was just listening to what you guys were saying. Really, I think that we need to just do it. We need to do something small, like we were discussing, and I think that I totally agree with the whole thing about value and about that a lot of this stuff you can't measure. I mean, why does a Dogecoin have value? Because it's emotional. It's an emotional thing. I think that dog, a cute little picture of that dog, that was the whole thing. It was an emotional thing. It's not innovative. It's a carbon copy. They also made it emotional because they said, what is there, like 1 billion total coins or something like that? So it's like it's a kind of emotional thing, and it was a good example of how this kind of emotions are really important. That's a big thing. It's not just technical, it's also art, it's also emotional. It's kind of like Dogecoin is kind of like a little mixture of both. Okay, the value of it is going down at the moment,
Yeah,
but
I
whatever.
think
But
so.
that's not the point. The point is that it just shows what we were talking about. It's not. Some people would say it's not perfect because it has a lot of flaws in the sense that it's not very technical. It's just a copy. You know, we were talking. It's not really the most efficient one. And even though it's a cryptocurrency, it's not really if extra efficient with all of these crazy features. But nonetheless, people still um, like to use it. You know, so and
Yeah, I
yeah,
mean, these cryptocurrencies are for sure an art market of sorts, right? That
yeah.
people are buying into them for emotional reasons, not certainly not for rational ones anyway. The only people that are really acting rationally right now are the exchanges. They're the biggest problem that we've got because where I think that we're going, and I don't want to be too transhumanist because I'm really not, but I do think there are elements of the transhumanist movement that are kind of capturing. It's certainly a future that we're sleepwalking into if we're not going to be too conscious about it. And I think what I see when I read a lot of that stuff is that they're saying, look, this is similar. I mean, I'm constructing it, but this is what I'm hearing, is that it's similar to the Neolithic period where we, instead of going out for our food every day, we took a section of land and we got the most out of that as space across the planet became scarcer. And that scarcity of space gave rise to an abundance of time as we started to divide ourselves up into groups, and then different members of the tribe could start doing the agriculture so that the others could come up with things like, oh, I don't know, philosophy, religion, commerce, and pretty much downhill ever since then. But now we're seeing a similar kind of paradigm shift where instead of me having to go out to the professions in order to get my knowledge, that knowledge comes to me. So the internet is now much more of a pull environment where I'm downloading everything. What the blockchain does, and particularly with distributed storage and mesh nets, is now it's an everyone has everything principle. So now everyone is going to store everyone else's files in sort of like a torrent manner, but it's going to be fragmented. And it's not so much a case of proximity as much as accessibility. It's not that things will be far away or that they'll be closed. It's just that some things will be accessible because they're decipherable, and some things won't be. And actually, even as we're talking now, this is all encrypted, right? All of this, all the language that we're using is encrypted to anyone who is not from this planet or doesn't speak English. Or, these signals that go down all conform to certain protocols and regulations in order to be made sense of. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Now, somebody is suggesting that we talk about the protection of the body in terms of martial arts. I wanted to go to Ksenia because every time I do, after a period of us talking, she always comes up with a killer point. So before we get to that, Ksenia, you say.
I got a bit distracted because I will have to go soon, but I think I would like to maybe just continue the conversation on Reddit and like drop some links, etc. Because there's a lot to comment on because we sort of touched on many things, and also most of the things I agree with, and it kind of not really. I mean, what can I say? I agree, but I usually comment when I disagree strongly.
How valuable, James, do you think this kind of activism that we're taking part in right now is? Because you talked about action. Of course, speech is an action. It's just it can be described often as slacktivism. Do you think that what we're doing, and don't be afraid to be outspoken to me, but do you think I'm acting enough? Am I doing enough by doing these shows and promoting it on Twitter and things?
I mean, I don't think the problem is with the people who are in this hangout. I think the problem is with some of the other 5 billion people who are maybe don't have access to the resources that we've got access to be able to make some to have the time to understand the world that they live in. They're stuck in a system which means they have to go to work, and this is a recursive process, which means they never have the time to really step back from it. So there's more and more people like us, but there's not many, and the number is not growing very fast. So the larger question is, how do we take it to a group of people? And my test case for this would be the City of London. How do you take this to people who work in finance in London? How do you try and persuade them of a different way of life? If we can't do that, if we can't build that story into something which starts to change things on a larger scale, then we're just talking.
Well, they have to withdraw their consent. Like I do talks for financial. I went to Lloyd's, for example, a few weeks ago, and I do tell them hard truths. And do you know who invites me in? It's usually a guy whose job it is to actually put on that kind of extracurricular activity. And the reason is because HR departments always talk about giving workers relief from their desk. So you've got to give them relief from the daily grind. So put a contrarian on stage, put someone who like disagrees. It's almost like the beast inside is aware of its own kind of, I don't know, evil, and it wants to get something from the outside. So Chris gets wheeled in, and I get given 20 minutes to tell them they're all evil. I don't really, but I do. It's kind of like stand-up philosophy. It's a bit funny. I try to make it as engaging as possible, but I also try to appeal to the individual rather than the institution. So I'm talking to them as individuals, and I make sure I make lots and lots and lots of eye contact. The other technique that I've tried in the City of London is going to their meetups. So you go to meetup.com and look up like a financial services meetup, and they all get together in a pub and just go in and kind of, you know, break out from the inside a little bit. It's much easier to do it around a table of like 8 people and say like, what did you want to be when you were 7? And they'll say like, oh, no, I used to play the saxophone. It's like, well, what do you do now? I work in a, you know, work for a fascist boss, you know, who's like really grinding me. Oh, tell me about that, you know. And then they start pouring their heart out, and it's like, oh, you know. And this one guy, gosh, I won't say it on air, but he was diagnosed with this illness, and he was starting to become very, very aware of his finitude and his finite amount of time. And he works for quite a big, famous financial organization in the UK. And yeah, he was actually kind of really like struck by the conversation that I was having. And so it's just really reminding individuals that they have the power over the institution. This doesn't have to be as Kafkaesque as it often appears to be, where the institution starts to bear down on the individual and force it to do its own will.
Just a couple of minor. One of the market efficiencies that is ubiquitous is not just the gentrification and the more efficient use of urban space, is the increasingly efficient use of human leisure time. One of the things I found really interesting, I had to do some research on it about 2 months ago, is looking at the historical trends in leisure time. And Paleolithic times, the best evidence are they had substantially more leisure time than we have now in Western societies. So it makes systemic sense for a market-driven economy to decrease our non-quantified leisure time. In other words, our non-monetized leisure time. So as long as we're paying for sports activities or other things, that's fine. But if we're kind of chilling out doing something which has no monetary exchange value, that's just dead as far as the system goes. And the more someone can monetize that aspect of time, the more successful that organization or individual will be. I mean, in fact, you can just increase GDP by decreasing non-quantified or non-monetized leisure time. The inherent properties of markets to become more efficient and to drive out anything that's not measured in its terms of value and efficiency, and the consequent destruction of diversity is probably the biggest problem I think we face on the planet.
Yeah, but I think that's over, David. I think that died 6 years ago, and the system is now in zombie mode. Okay, that's my take on it. You see, the fundamentally, what has been happening is rent extraction, and in technical terms, economic rent means something for nothing. Okay, if you can come up with a system which is always going to be something for something, and you can do if you structure it correctly, you can route around any rent extractor. Then that actually, in economic terms, you can. I believe that capitalism is about to, you know, eat itself for lunch, because it's possible to configure things. This point about prepay that I go on and on about, this the form of credit that predates modern capitalism, it actually makes redundant debt, it makes redundant equity, it makes redundant derivatives. I used to design derivatives for a living, so I understand, I think, what I'm talking about when it comes to financial instrument design. I'm absolutely sure.
How does that make things more inefficient?
Well, it makes, it depends what your metric is, David. Your metric, the current market's metric for efficiency is that symbol that looks squiggly and is a pound, or that symbol which is squiggly with a line down it, which is $1. What do those things mean, David? That those things actually represent a negative. They represent debt. That's what they represent. I believe that the economy of the future will be based upon a positive, which is a unit of account. The only objectively valuable unit there is a unit for energy. Everything has an energy cost. I'm not saying that everything should be energy currency, far from it. I'm saying that we should keep score of certain transactions in an objective way, but we also need to keep score subjectively in terms of other forms of cost. But
energy and matter are the same thing, so that would also apply to capital as well.
You see, what people don't understand what the Danes did about 40 years ago was so important. Okay, this is a slight digression, but not much. 40 years ago, in the oil shock, what happened was the Danes, who had no oil and gas, saw their energy costs treble almost overnight, and they shat themselves at that point. And what they did was, they said, right, now this is the magnificent thing that they did. They said, from here on in, for a given amount of heat, electricity, and power that we use, we will minimize the carbon fuel that goes into our system, okay? And everything they did was in accordance with what I call least carbon fuel cost policy, same as least energy cost, actually. And that has given rise to very different outcomes compared to the conventional least dollar cost, which they were following. In the 40 years in between, and I could list the policies they've used, their GDP has doubled, okay, their energy use has been the same pretty much, and their carbon fuel use has actually declined. And they did that with this overarching principle across all energy policy of keeping score using a metric of energy cost, okay? That is something that everybody can do. It's what I'm doing up here in Linlithgow, where I live, on a local scale. We're going to create what I call the Linlithgow natural grid, not the national grid. The national grid is what you get when you apply least sterling cost policies. We're going to apply least carbon fuel cost policies. We're going to put in CHP. We're going to put in every intervention we can make to reduce energy use in Linlithgow, so that £6.5 million draining out of our economy is going to start falling. Okay, that's possible anywhere because the Danes have proven it. And what it comes down to is actually keeping score. What do you keep score in? What does that? Sorry.
Nowadays we have these really powerful sensors called computers that can actually keep a very accurate and an objective account of use. And also one of the other benefits of cryptography is that these things don't have to be apparent to us all the time. They can be hidden, they can be forgotten if you want, because just encrypting a piece of data and throwing away the password is the equivalent of throwing it away. You still have the data mass, but you don't have the information inside of it. Yep. So when people do talk about the need to forget, or I talk about the need to forget our way into a future, that a lot of the conflicts that you're seeing at the moment, where shared energy is actually fueling the conflict, like particularly with Russia and Eastern Europe, where the main gas line coming into that landmass is coming from Russia, is it creates dependencies and then creates unstable agreements in the diplomacy, because now people have other agendas and other considerations to make. They're not able to talk honestly because they are dependent on the gas from Russia, for example.
Exact.
So basically, you're just saying that the debt-based system is in zombie mode. That's going to be finished.
Yep.
And that what the Danes did is they, basically they made things more efficient in regards to the use of the carbon-based fuels. Is that right?
Yeah, and they did it across a whole variety of interventions. Spatial use is one of them. So any architects would understand some of the things they did. They, more efficient use of space. Was it Kunstler? He's got that blog, Clusterfuck Nation. What a great name. And he says that American suburbia is the greatest misallocation of resources in human history. That's a fantastic quote, and it's based on cheap fuel. So that any intervention you can make, whether it's spatial, whether it's the use of energy, embedded energy in buildings, you name it, the Danes are doing it. And they've made it a damn good business as well while they're at it. The Danes have the biggest wind turbine manufacturer in the world, Vestas, and they're a country of 6 million people. That's a result as well.
So did they decoupled their currency from debt, or
no? What they did, basically, what I'm saying, they didn't achieve it through the mechanisms I would advocate. They achieved it because they actually had the institutional capacity to invest. The public sector in Denmark was quite devolved, and they had a lot of resources, so they were able to finance these interventions at local level. Whereas in a privatized market like ours, it ain't going to happen. They're always going to go for the least sterling cost solution, you see. Whereas in Denmark, they were able to drive through these policy interventions with public sector resources. That's what they're able to do in Denmark that nobody else has been able to do.
Chris, there's a question I've never asked you actually, which is, I read The Economist a lot because it's always around, because my dad, who I've always argued with about these things, reads it all the time. And it's a pretty interesting kind of newspaper. I like to read things I disagree with, but I certainly respect its journalism. Now, a lot of the time, there was the way that the logic, and that fundamentally is, a good journal with regard to describing the positive side of market forces and the increased efficiency it brings, if you like. One question is, how on earth can you reconcile all of what you're saying with the ability or the requirement to systemically or globally reduce, let's say, population pressure? I mean, a lot of the Economist articles about the need for immigration in order to prop up falling birth rates, in order to be an efficient market and to keep GDP up, in order to compete with your neighbors. You can get so far with productivity, but really, you do need on addition to that, there's the requirement for military defense of these nation states and countries with regard to having if you end up being a shrinking population, well, then you're going to have less say in the world, and you may well. I mean, I had a conversation with someone who pointed out that drones might solve that problem, but I'm just wondering how you can describe what you're talking about in terms of getting rid of middlemen, about making market measuring different values so that we can keep score and make agreements, which in some ways I agree is a prerequisite for maybe a lot of things that are important in life, not all, but a lot. How can you see these mechanisms enabling us to do something like reduce populations, national populations and global populations?
Well, you're presupposing that reduction is actually necessary. I would contend that.
But just presuppose that. I mean, imagine a world in which there were 1 billion people living on it, and the results.
1 million.
1 billion, or 1 million even.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's plenty out there. It's just not,
Is it possible for markets, as you see them, to end up in that space?
It's not possible for the markets as we have them to end up in that space.
As you see them.
As I see them, I'm absolutely convinced that if we apply collaborative and transparent networked agreements, that that we will very rapidly evolve in the direction which I can see, because it's in everybody's. It comes down to a very simple economic decision, David, that if you've got a system where it is, the question is, would you rather have 100% of nothing or a smaller percentage of something? 99.9%, apart from the psychopaths, would actually choose, yeah, actually, I'll go for the collaborative solution because I'm going to make more. So it's harnessing rational self-interest to a common protocol, to a public, to a common agreed purpose. I think it's completely possible to do that. And the only thing that's been holding it back has been the existence of this financial intermediation, which is now conclusively and permanently broken. We are going to transcend that.
Yeah.
No question about that.
And basically, I see whatever you tinker with the existing sort of fundamentally competitive game of a quantitative market valuation, you really need to be you need to introduce radically different sorts of gameplay, is how I describe it.
Well, you do, but it's David, it's complementary. This
Yeah,
word,
but they're very different beasts from how we see. I know you talk about, but I mean, if I talk about the sort of different beasts that we need rather than market games and valuation and registries, I talk much more about theatre and network theatre. I talk about agreements that people make in physical groups. I talk about how you can scale those agreements. I talk about mixed martial arts. I talk about how people respect and value, and how you can capture honor. How these sorts of things are really so far away from what markets amplify.
At the moment, but we have to get there from here, David, and we can only do that through an adjacent possible.
I agree with that.
Which is what complementary is all about. I have in mind exactly what you have in mind, but we have to get there from here.
The way I see that link, by the way, is because it troubled me hugely, especially when I started to look at Pareto's distribution and those sorts of things, which are almost, a story has always haunted me about a friend of mine that actually fell out with ages ago, and a story that was passed on to me. He said, "Yeah, he's a counter." That's the problem that people had with him. In other words, he was extremely useful, he was generous, he was fun, he was great, but he counted every single transaction he had with people, and he came back to you like 3 months later and said, but I lent you this, this, and this on such and such a day. I mean, he had that kind of brain. And people found that really problematic. And for ages, when I was interested in currencies and community currencies, I had this problem about what if we just quantify all of human value? What if we keep this register that you're talking about, Chris? Doesn't that destroy a huge amount of what we call human beings to have, right?
Well, you can, David, you can keep it, but you need not use. Sorry to interrupt. You can keep it, but you need not use it. Let me just give you an example, an empirical.
Just say one line, and then you give me the example. The way that I eventually reconciled that is to think of, again, game design. Games basically often require, in terms of the programmers, to quantify your energy levels or your honor levels, but the interface is entirely different. You don't get down to measuring and thinking about the units. You get your badge of honor because you've battled on this, and that's what you remember. Your interface, the human interface to the underlying DNA or logic, doesn't have to be numbers and spreadsheets.
No, I don't disagree with you. The example I was going to give, I've been on the, Mary Fee, who's behind the Let's system and has kept the Let's flame alive for many, many years. And she has been looking at Let's systems, community currency systems, for those who don't know, for many years. And whenever a Let's scheme sort of disappears, she would follow up to find out what went wrong, or after a while, where are they now? And very frequently she found that, in fact, they hadn't actually disappeared because they failed. They disappeared because the people in the scheme stopped keeping score. Okay, right. They had become a trust. Trust had actually through experience, trust had developed. To start with, they kept score, and after a while, then the trust actually built up, and they stopped keeping score. And I think
That happened at the Oxford Pound, because we started our Feathercoin project in Oxford, and then we were told that the Oxford Pound, just all these people lost their scores because the person running it didn't want to run it anymore. And as a result, what we're finding with these blockchains as a way of keeping score is that they never die, because they're anti-fragile, and so long as someone is hashing the network, it only takes two nodes on the network at any one time. That blockchain is forever, and it persists on all of these hard drives. Now, I do have to ask us if we can wrap up, but it's so damn interesting. Of course, I say this on a lot of episodes. We have to do it again. But that's just creating the necessity for more episodes. I would say we've totally forgotten to do the Q&A because we were so engrossed. So I just want to, if I can, invite you back for another show so we can carry the songs. I was really enjoying listening to Chris and David talk there. But just to say that David Gilson, our longtime friend of WCN, has come in as we've been talking, and I've just screen grabbed, David, your questions, so I'll put those in the comments below. You're talking about the creative work registry is somewhat exploitable, as someone could make a minor change to something to get a completely different hash. So this is when I was talking about the notional record of, like, I create some artwork and I create a hash of it. Well, what David is saying is, look, well, someone else could just come along and then they could change it imperceptibly, and that would give them a new hash as if they'd owned it. That is correct, but we also have, of course, the timestamp that goes with the hash. So it's not that you created, this work at this time.
And family resemblance.
Yeah, okay, that's good. And then what happens is the time that it was stamped also gets put in the ledger, and then what I'm proposing, or at least some investigation into, is some kind of reputational system which allows for the good stuff to rise to the top. So everyone has their reputational capital, and every time you make a claim on the network and you say, yes, I've witnessed this artwork, that artwork will then naturally rise to the top as being witnessed, because the reputational capital of the person doing the claim and the tagging carries with it their own honesty and weight over time. And of course, because everyone's got discretionary attention, we can't do lots of things at once. The citizen is going to be faced with a choice. They could either go through life making a menace of themselves at the expense of living a real life and go through and claiming they've witnessed this and that and they haven't really witnessed, or they could just live an honest life. It's not a perfect system yet. I'm still drafting it, and I proposed it to a few people that are smarter than me so that I can sort of test it out. But this is kind of, I think that we are, with this technology, we are creating a meta witness. We're creating a new witness, because unlike the human mind, it is very resilient over the long term. The human mind isn't very good at dealing with memory, long-term memory, but it's much better at doing short-term memory. Conversely, computers aren't very good with short-term memory. That's why we call RAM volatile, because as soon as you take the power out, it's forgotten what it's doing. And as a result, I think that we've got to think about how we can work side by side with this technology. So that is a good point, and it's definitely something we need to think about. He's also, David Gilson is also bringing up an article in Coinbuzz, which I will copy and paste right now and put in the comments later, and that's to do with using the blockchain as proof of work. And then, of course, we also talked about justice and being able to vote on a blockchain. So yeah, again, too much to even talk about. Now, what I'm trying to do with the show is I'm not trying to come up with all the answers. I'm trying to come up with the right questions. I'm trying to build a space that people can come into so that the right answers can emerge, rather than just trying to be right all the time. And that means, giving up what I think I know, also inviting people on, like our guests today, David, Chris, and James, Ksenia, who I didn't necessarily know very well. It's just that I met them yesterday, but there was a little something in there that I liked, and I wasn't sure that I agreed with it all. But then as you kind of listen and you go in with more curiosity, then you actually find you might surprise yourself. There is something in there. I have been trying to do a show on the Gaza-Israeli conflict. I can't, because every time I try and research this damn thing, the rat's nest gets thicker and thicker and thicker, and I'm constantly feeling under pressure to take a side. Everything I read comes imbued with an agenda, and I'm constantly having to work hard at not just learning the history of this conflict, but also learning about all the different tribal factions. And so if anyone thinks they can help me with that, or anyone wants to come on the show who can speak about it in an intelligent way, I'd really like to be educated about this conflict live on air, so that everyone can kind of finally go, oh, okay, we can talk about this without possibly being called an anti-Semite or being, accused of anything kind of inflammatory without realizing it. Because otherwise, I don't think we're ever going to get to the bottom of this thing. I certainly can't spend all my time watching these pictures of kids dying and then just sitting here and not doing anything about it. So thank you very much to my guests. Yes, David, Chris, James, Theo, Nick, and Ksenia. Thank you very much for being here today. I would also like to put out an appeal to anyone who would like to volunteer to timestamp a lot of what we're saying. In the comments below in YouTube, if you type in a time signature like 42:30, it will actually automatically turn that into a link. So every time you hear someone like Chris or David make a really good point, you can actually timestamp that in the comments, and then when new visitors come to the video, they can just go straight to that section. That would be really, really helpful. And also, as per usual, you can follow us on Twitter at WorldCryptoNet, and you can follow me on Twitter as well at Mr. Chris Ellis. So until next time, thank you very much, everyone. You can say goodbye, and we will see you probably next week.
Cheers, Chris.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers. Thank you.